I am 72 years old. I have read the Bible cover to cover more times than I can count. I have sat through thousands of sermons. I have studied in quiet rooms before sunrise and wrestled with Scripture in the dark hours of the night. I have carried this book through grief, through joy, through seasons that nearly broke me, and seasons that rebuilt me from the ground up. And yet, there is one verse, one single verse, that I read for the first time at 22 years old, nodded at, and walked right past. I thought I understood it. I said the words out loud. I even wrote it on a note card once and taped it to my refrigerator. But I didn't understand it. Not really. Not the way you understand something when it has been proven true by decades of living. It took me 50 years to finally grasp what this verse was actually saying. And when I did, when it finally broke open inside me like light flooding a room that had been sealed shut for half a century, I sat down in my chair and wept. Not from sadness, from recognition. From the overwhelming realization that God had been trying to tell me this the entire time, and I had been too young, too proud, too impatient to hear it. Stay with me until the end, because what I am about to share is not theology from a seminary. It is not a polished sermon from a pulpit. It is something far more raw than that. It is 72 years of a human life laid down next to one sentence from Scripture, and what happened when they finally met each other honestly. The verse is Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. 12 words. That is all it takes to read it. 12 words that nearly every Christian has memorized, quoted, printed on coffee mugs, stitched onto pillows. 12 words that have been spoken at more funerals, more hospital bedsides, more moments of crisis than perhaps any other passage in the New Testament. And yet, most people who say it do not yet know what it means. I know, because I was one of them for 50 years. The version I believed at 22. When I first encountered Romans 8:28, I was a young man full of certainty and almost entirely empty of wisdom. I had recently given my life to God, and in the way of new believers everywhere, I was eager and electric with faith. I wanted answers. I wanted systems. I wanted a God who operated like a vending machine. Insert prayer, receive blessing. And Romans 8:28 seemed to confirm everything I hoped was true. In all things, God works for the good. To my 22-year-old mind, that was a promise of outcomes. It meant that if I loved God faithfully, my life would resolve toward good things. Good health, good relationships, good circumstances. Every difficulty would turn around. Every loss would be replaced. Every closed door would eventually swing open. Every storm would clear into sunshine. I believed that with everything I had. And for a few years, that version of the verse seemed to hold up. I was young and strong and building a life. Things went wrong sometimes, but they also went right. And when they went right, I pointed at my verse and said, "See? God works all things for good." I had no idea what was coming. The year the verse stopped working. I was 34 when my first real catastrophe arrived. My wife and I had been trying to have children for 3 years. 3 years of doctors and waiting rooms and hope stretched so thin it became almost translucent. And then, finally, she was pregnant. We told our parents. We told our friends. We painted a room in our house the color of morning sky. And then, at 5 months, we lost him. A son. We had already named him. I remember sitting in the hospital parking lot afterward, unable to drive, unable to speak, unable to do anything but stare at the steering wheel. And somewhere in the wreckage of that hour, Romans 8:28 surfaced in my mind the way a wound surfaces when you press on it. All things work together for good. For the first time in my life, I felt something close to fury at that verse. What was good here? Where was the good? I had loved God. I had believed. I had done everything right. And a 5-month-old son was gone, and a painted room waited at home for a child who would never sleep in it. The verse felt like a lie. And here is what I did, the thing that would cost me the next 30 years of deeper understanding. I resolved the tension by shrinking the verse, rather than letting the verse expand me. I told myself, this pain is temporary. God will bring the good. It will arrive. Hold on. I turned Romans 8:28 into a promise about the future rather than a truth about the present. I made it about what would eventually happen rather than what was already happening. And by doing that, I survived the grief, but I missed the revelation. God was patient with me. He kept the real meaning waiting, what the verse actually says, and what it doesn't. Before I tell you when the understanding finally arrived, I want to stop here and look at the verse closely. Because the first thing that needs to be said is what Romans 8:28 does not say. It does not say all things are good. Read it again. God works for the good. That is an entirely different claim. It does not announce that every event in your life is a good event. It does not say that losing a child is good, that betrayal is good, that illness is good, that poverty is good. It says nothing of the kind. The verse is not a declaration about the quality of your circumstances. It is a declaration about the activity of God within your circumstances. There is a vast and holy difference between those two things, and I spent the better part of 5 decades standing on the wrong side of that line. The word translated works in the original Greek is the word synerge, the root from which we get the word synergy. It carries the meaning of things operating together, of multiple forces collaborating toward a single outcome. God is not looking at your life from a distance and promising that things will feel better soon. He is inside the machinery of your experience, taking every element, the beautiful ones, the broken ones, the ones that make no sense whatsoever, and weaving them with a craftsmanship so intricate that no human mind could track it. The verse does not say your suffering will be replaced by good. It says your suffering is being used for good, right now, in real time, even when you cannot see it, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. That is not a comfortable promise. That is a terrifying and glorious one. 50 years of evidence. I am going to tell you what 50 more years of living with this verse taught me, and I am going to tell it as plainly as I know how. After we lost our son, my wife and I walked through 2 more years of grief and medical uncertainty. And then, at 37, she gave birth to our daughter. And at 39, our second daughter. 2 children who would grow into 2 of the most remarkable human beings I have ever known. For many years, I looked at that and said, there it is. That is the good. God replaced the loss. But I was still getting it wrong. Even in the gratitude, I was still misreading the verse. Because I was still treating God's goodness like a ledger, 1 entry of pain offset by 2 entries of joy. That is bookkeeping. That is not Romans 8:28. The real understanding began much later. I was 58. My marriage, which I had always considered the most solid foundation of my life, entered the hardest season it had ever known. Not a dramatic rupture, but something slower and more frightening. A drifting. A silence that grew between us like a wall built 1 brick at a time over years. I was proud. I was stubborn. I was convinced that the person who needed to change was the person sitting across the dinner table from me. And during that season, I remember picking up my Bible one night in a kind of exhausted desperation, the way you try a door you've tried 100 times, hoping that this time it might open differently. And I landed on Romans 8:28. In all things, God works for the good. And something was different this time. I was older. I was tired. My certainties had been worn smooth by decades of use until they were no longer sharp enough to protect me from the truth. And the thought that formed in my mind was this: what if the good God is working toward is not a better version of my circumstances, but a better version of me? What if the all things includes my own pride, my own blindness, my own careful constructions of who I thought I was? What if the good is not something God is delivering to me, but something God is building within me? That question cracked me open in a way that nothing else had. The thing nobody tells you about this verse. Here is what I wish someone had sat me down and said when I was 22, fresh-faced and newly saved, and copying Bible verses onto note cards. Romans 8:28 is not a comfort verse in the way most people use it. Most people reach for it when life goes wrong, as if it were a painkiller. They quote it to themselves or to grieving friends as a way of saying, "Don't worry, it'll work out." And there is mercy in that impulse. I understand it completely. But the verse is not principally about relief. It is about transformation. Look at what Paul writes immediately after Romans 8:28. Most people read that verse and stop. But the next verse, Romans 8:29, reveals the destination toward which God is working all things. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Conformed to the image of his Son. That is the good. That is the destination. That is what God is building with all things, the beautiful ones and the shattered ones alike. God is not managing your comfort. He is shaping your character. He is not primarily interested in giving you a pleasant life. He is interested in producing a transformed one. And that changes everything about how you read the hard chapters. The loss that broke me at 34, that was not random suffering that God later compensated for with 2 daughters. That grief was itself a tool in hands that were working toward something I could not yet see. It carved chambers in my heart that would not otherwise exist. It taught me a tenderness toward other grieving people that I could never have learned from a book. It put me on my knees in ways that my younger, comfortable self would never have knelt. The difficult marriage years at 58, those were not an obstacle to the good life God had planned for me. They were part of the architecture of the man God intended me to become. The places where I had to face myself honestly, the long process of learning to say I was wrong, the slow and costly work of choosing someone over and over again when it would have been easier to stop, that was formation. That was the image of the Son being pressed into the clay of me. None of it felt like good at the time. All of it was. The hardest word in the verse. I want to draw your attention to 2 words that most people slide right past. The verse says, all things. Not some things. Not the things you can explain. Not the things that eventually turn around. All things. I spent decades unconsciously editing that phrase. In practice, I read it as most things, or eventually things, or the things that fall within the range of what I can accept as purposeful. I was, without realizing it, maintaining a list in my own mind of the things that clearly fit God's plan, and a separate list of the things that were simply accidents or mistakes, or evidence that the world was broken. But the verse doesn't permit that division. The afternoon you received news that leveled you, the relationship that ended without resolution, the dream you gave everything to that still did not come true, the health that declined, the years that were stolen by depression or addiction, or a pain you have never once been able to name out loud. All of it. Every bit of it. God is working within every bit of it toward the same destination, toward conformity with the image of his Son. That is either the most terrifying sentence in Scripture or the most liberating one, depending entirely on how much you trust the craftsman. I spent 50 years not trusting him enough. Not because I doubted his existence, but because I doubted his definition of good. My definition of good was comfortable and painless and successful and admired. His definition of good was Christ-like. Those are not the same thing. Jesus himself walked through betrayal, abandonment, suffering, and death, and the Father worked every bit of it toward the greatest good the universe has ever witnessed. If we belong to God, we should not be surprised when our own path runs through valleys we did not choose. What I know now that I couldn't know then. I am 72 now. My wife and I have been married for 47 years, and the hard seasons we walked through together built something between us that the easy years never could have. When I look at her across a room, I see someone who stayed, someone I chose to stay for. That choosing, repeated through the difficult years, became something I would not trade for anything this world could offer. My daughters are grown. One of them went through a season of her own darkness several years ago, and the tenderness I had been given through grief became the only language that reached her. The chambers carved in me at 34 had been prepared for that exact conversation 30 years in advance. I look back across the full sweep of 7 decades, and I can trace, dimly but unmistakably, a thread that ran through all of it. Through the losses and the failures and the seasons that made no sense while I was living through them. I cannot see all of it. Much of it remains hidden from me. But I can see enough. Enough to believe that the all things in that verse means exactly what it says. Enough to know that the good God is building is not the life I would have designed for myself. It is something older and deeper and more enduring than comfort. It is the slow, costly, magnificent work of becoming. A word to the young. If you are 22 or 30 or 40, reading or watching this, I want to say something directly to you. Do not wait 50 years to understand this verse. I am not saying you can shortcut the experience. You cannot. Some things can only be learned through time and through living. No amount of studying or listening can hand you what only decades can build. But what you can do is stop running from the chapters that are hard. The reflex of every young believing heart is to read Romans 8:28 and use it as a reason to expect relief. But the deeper reading, the one that takes decades to find if you are not looking, is an invitation to trust the process rather than rushing toward the outcome. When the hard thing comes, do not only ask God to remove it, ask Him what He is building. When the loss arrives and it does not make sense, do not only pray for the replacement, pray for the eyes to see what is being worked. Not instead of grieving. Grief is honest, and God is not afraid of your tears. But alongside the grief, open a small window in your soul toward the possibility that something you cannot see is being shaped. This is not resignation. This is not the defeated shrug of someone who has given up on expecting good things. This is the deepest kind of faith, the faith that trusts the character of God even when the circumstances of life offer no visible confirmation. That faith, practiced over decades, becomes something unshakable. I know because I have it now, and I know when it arrived, and I know what it cost, and I would not undo a single thing that produced it. The verse I finally understand, Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. At 22, I read good and thought it meant happy. At 34, I tested the verse against grief and found it wanting. At 58, I began to understand that the problem was never the verse. At 72, I can tell you with everything I am that this is the truest sentence I have ever read. Not because my life has been without loss, it has held more than its share, but because I have watched God work inside the losses with a patience and a precision that I never would have believed at 22. The good He is building does not always look like what we expected. It is often quieter. It is sometimes slower. It is occasionally built from materials we would never have chosen. But it is real. It is more real than anything I have seen. And one of the most sobering and beautiful things I can tell you is this. I believe I am still not done. At 72, I believe there are still things being worked, still formation underway, still chapters of this that I will not understand until I am older, or until I am on the other side of this life entirely, and I can finally see the full pattern. That does not frighten me anymore. It steadies me. One final thought. Before I close, I want to ask you something. Is there a chapter in your life right now that you have placed outside the all things? A circumstance so painful or so confusing that you have quietly decided God cannot be working in it? A loss that still sits in you like something unanswered. I want to invite you to bring it back inside the verse. Not to pretend it doesn't hurt. It does. Not to manufacture a reason why it was good. You may never find one this side of eternity. But to simply hold it before God with open hands and say, I do not understand this. I do not see the good here. But I am choosing to trust that you are working in it, because your word says you are, and because 50 years of evidence in one ordinary human life suggests that you tell the truth. That prayer, spoken honestly, is not weakness. It is the bravest thing a person can say. I wish I had said it at 34. I had to wait until 58 to mean it. But I am saying it now, and I will keep saying it, for however many years I have remaining. Because in all things, He is working. In every single thing. Working towards something better than we can ask for. Better than we can imagine. Better than anything we would have chosen for ourselves. That is the verse I finally understand. It only took me 50 years, and every year of that was worth it. If this spoke to something in your own story, leave your thoughts below. What chapter of your life have you been wrestling to hand over? What verse took decades before it finally opened up for you? These conversations matter more than you know. And if you want to go deeper into the kind of scripture that only reveals itself slowly, the passages that require a whole life to read fully, click on the video on your screen right now. There is still so much more to discover. Blessings.